Hello, everyone. Let me ask you something before we begin. Is it ever morally justifiable to arm your enemy's enemy, knowing full well that they might one day become your own? Operation Cyclone. How the US armed Afghanistan's Mujahideen. The telex machine in the Islamabad station chattered to life on Christmas Eve 1979, with a mechanical urgency that felt alien to the festive decorations still clinging to the embassy walls. I was Jack Keller, a case officer barely a year into my posting, still getting used to the thick, spiced air of Pakistan and the labyrinthine politics of our host nation. The message was terse, stripped of all but the essential, terrifying facts. Soviet airborne divisions had landed at Kabul airport. The 40th Army was rolling across the Amu Darya. Amin was dead. Babrak Karmal was in. It wasn't an invasion in the classic sense. It was a decapitation strike, a swift, brutal assertion of Moscow's will. The Cold War, which had felt like a distant chess match played out in Berlin and Langley, had just landed on our doorstep with the force of a tank shell. The immediate reaction in the station was a controlled panic, a frantic scramble to verify, to analyze, to report back to a Washington, D.C. that was just waking up to the news. President Carter, I'd later learn, felt personally betrayed by Brezhnev. His response was swift. Sanctions, a boycott of the Moscow Olympics, and something else. Something quieter and more significant that would come to define my career and the next decade of my life. He signed the first presidential finding, authorizing the CIA to provide covert support to the Afghan resistance. It was a modest beginning, almost laughably so. We were cleared for non-lethal aid. We were sending them radios, medical supplies, and cash. A few $1 million to start. The idea wasn't to help them win. Nobody in their right mind thought a scattered collection of tribal fighters could defeat the Red Army. The goal, as articulated by National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, was far more cynical: to give the Soviets their own Vietnam, to bleed them, to make the occupation as costly and painful as possible. My job shifted overnight. I went from cultivating diplomatic contacts and analyzing political tea leaves to becoming a logistics man in a ghost war. Our partners in this venture were Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI. The agency was the brainchild and personal fiefdom of President Zia-ul-Haq, a shrewd and deeply religious military dictator who saw the Soviet invasion as both an existential threat and a golden opportunity. He would be our gatekeeper, our middleman. All aid, every dollar and every bandage, had to go through the ISI. Our primary contact was Brigadier General Akhtar Abdur Rahman Khan, the head of the ISI. He was a man who seemed carved from granite, his eyes holding a permanent, calculating glint. He understood the game better than we did. In our first meetings, he laid it out plainly. The Americans wanted to hurt the Soviets. The Pakistanis wanted strategic depth against India and a friendly, pliable government in Kabul. The Mujahideen, the holy warriors, wanted to drive the godless communists from their land. For a brief, shining moment, all our interests aligned. Akhtar assured us the ISI would handle the distribution. They knew the tribes, the commanders, the terrain. We were to provide the resources. They would deliver the results. It was a neat, tidy arrangement that kept American fingerprints off the operation. We were a step removed, insulated, or so we told ourselves. In those early months of 1980, the pipeline, as we called it, was more of a trickle. I would arrange cash drops in unmarked briefcases, coordinate shipments of British-made Lee Enfield 303 rifles, World War I relics bought on the open market, and listen to Akhtar's reports on the burgeoning resistance. The fighters were brave, he'd say, but they were being slaughtered. Soviet Mi-24. Hind gunships, Satan's chariots, roamed the valleys with impunity, their rotary cannons and rocket pods tearing apart anything that moved. The Mujahideen had nothing to fight them with but rifles and prayers. The reports we sent back to Langley were grim. The resistance was valiant but futile. They were dying for a cause we were only pretending to support. The non-lethal aid was a joke, a symbolic gesture. It was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a bucket. We were giving them enough rope to hang themselves, not to win a war. A sense of futility began to creep into the station. We were watching a nation be consumed, and our response was a pittance. But then, far away, an election happened. Ronald Reagan won, and his campaign rhetoric wasn't about containment. It was about rollback. He didn't want to just bleed the Soviets. He wanted them to lose. The change was almost immediate. The whispers in the secure comms from Langley became louder, more aggressive. The questions were no longer if we should provide lethal aid, but what kind and how much. The modest budget was set to explode. The game was about to change, and we, the handful of officers in the Islamabad station, were standing at the epicenter of what would become the largest and most expensive covert operation in CIA history. We were about to open Pandora's box, and I, for one, was too young and too eager to truly appreciate the horrors that lay inside. The arrival of the Reagan administration in 1981 was like a shot of adrenaline directly into the heart of the program. The cautious, almost apologetic tone of the Carter years vanished. The new director of Central Intelligence, William Casey, was a different breed entirely. An OSS veteran from World War II, he saw the world in stark, uncompromising terms. Us versus them. Freedom versus communist tyranny. For Casey, Afghanistan wasn't a quagmire to exploit. It was a frontline battleground where the Soviet Empire could be broken. The mandate from the White House was clear: win. The budget, once measured in the low tens of millions, skyrocketed into the hundreds of millions per year. The term non-lethal was erased from our lexicon. My role as a glorified logistics clerk transformed. I was now an arms procurer, a coordinator in a clandestine global supply chain. The pipeline, once a trickle, was being engineered into a torrent. The first challenge was sourcing the weapons. We couldn't just ship crates of M16s from American armories. Plausible deniability was still the name of the game. The solution was a masterclass in covert procurement. CIA front companies and sympathetic third-party nations became our arsenal. We bought up massive stocks of Soviet bloc weaponry, AK-47s from Egypt, which was transitioning to American arms, RPG-7s from Poland and Romania through back channels, 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine guns from China, who saw the Soviets as a regional rival. Our logic was simple: give the Mujahideen weapons they were familiar with, weapons that couldn't be traced back to Uncle Sam. The logistics were staggering. Ships would leave ports in Europe and Asia, their manifests listing agricultural equipment or machine parts, and dock in Karachi. There, under the watchful eyes of the ISI, the crates would be loaded onto unmarked trucks belonging to Pakistan's National Logistics Cell. They would begin the long, rattling journey north, through the deserts of Sindh and the plains of Punjab, up to the sprawling, dusty depots around Peshawar and Quetta on the frontier. It was in Peshawar that the true nature of our partnership with the ISI became terrifyingly clear. We controlled the spigot in Washington and the port in Karachi, but the ISI controlled the warehouse and the final distribution. General Akhtar had established a system that gave him absolute authority. He decreed that all aid must be funneled through the 7 main Mujahideen political parties based in Peshawar, the so-called Peshawar 7. On the surface, it seemed like a fair way to manage the disparate factions. In reality, it was a tool for Akhtar to shape the resistance in Pakistan's image. He, not us, decided which commanders got the guns. And his favorite, by a country mile, was a firebrand Pashtun engineer named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Hekmatyar was a radical's radical. He was known for his ruthlessness, his ideological fervor, and his visceral hatred of the West. His fighters were notorious for throwing acid in the faces of women who dared to unveil themselves at Kabul University. He spent as much time fighting other Mujahideen factions as he did the Soviets. Yet, the ISI showered him with a disproportionate share of the weapons, including the best and most advanced systems. We protested in our secure cables to Langley. We argued that supporting Hekmatyar was suicidal. He was a snake we were warming by our fire. The response from headquarters was pragmatic and chilling. Hekmatyar's forces were effective killers of Soviet soldiers. That was the only metric that mattered. The mission was to kill Soviets, and Hekmatyar was good at it. Any long-term consequences were a problem for another day. I spent weeks at a time in Peshawar and the border regions, operating out of nondescript safe houses. The city was a chaotic swirl of spies, refugees, holy warriors, and arms dealers. You could smell the cordite and conspiracy in the air. I met commanders who came down from the mountains, their faces weathered by sun and war, their eyes burning with a piety that was both inspiring and unsettling. They would speak of their faith, of their willingness to die, and then they would hand me a shopping list for weapons. They needed more anti-tank rockets to deal with the BMPs. They needed heavy mortars. Most of all, they needed something, anything, to counter the Hind helicopters that hunted them from the sky. The Hinds were more than just a weapon. They were a psychological terror. They suppressed any daylight movement, pinned down entire units, and turned daring ambushes into massacres. The Mujahideen had heavy machine guns, the DSHKs or Dashikas, which could be a threat if they got lucky, but they were cumbersome and easily spotted. The Soviets owned the air. Every briefing with a commander, every after-action report, ended with the same desperate plea for an effective anti-aircraft weapon. We floated the idea of the British blowpipe missile, a clumsy and largely ineffective system. We considered the Swiss Oerlikon 20mm cannon, but it was too heavy to be hauled through the mountains. The war was escalating. We were giving them the means to fight a conventional ground war, but the Soviets adapted. They relied more and more on air power, on Spetsnaz commando raids delivered by helicopter. The Mujahideen were bleeding, but so were the Soviets. The Vietnam analogy was becoming real. The Kremlin was pouring in more troops, more armor, more aircraft, and we were matching them, weapon for weapon, dollar for dollar. The program was a success, but it felt like we were stoking a fire that was growing far beyond our control. We were creating one of the most effective and well-armed irregular armies in modern history, and we were entrusting its command and control to a foreign intelligence service whose ultimate goals were not our own. The question of the Hinds, however, wouldn't go away. It dominated every discussion. A charismatic, hard-drinking congressman from Texas named Charlie Wilson had taken up the cause, lobbying furiously in Washington to give the Mujas what they needed to kill helicopters. The stage was being set for the next, most dangerous escalation. The debate was no longer about AK-47s and RPGs. It was about giving them a weapon that could change the entire strategic balance of the war. A weapon that contained advanced American technology. A weapon that, if it fell into the wrong hands, could become a nightmare for civilian aviation around the world. The word Stinger began to be whispered in the secure rooms of the station, a name that promised both salvation and damnation. The pressure to introduce a man-portable air defense system, Amman pads became immense through 1984 and 1985. On one side, you had the operators in the field, the station chiefs in Islamabad, and our allies in the ISI, all reporting the same thing. Soviet air power, specifically the Mi-24 Hind and the Su-25 Frogfoot attack jet, was the single greatest obstacle to a Mujahideen victory. On the other side, you had a significant portion of the intelligence community and the Pentagon, terrified by the prospect of such a weapon going astray. Their nightmare scenario was simple and stark. A Stinger missile, one of ours, being used to shoot down a civilian airliner. The technology within the Stinger's guidance system was years ahead of anything the Soviets had. The risk of it falling into their hands was a strategic catastrophe. For months, the debate raged in Washington. The Stinger was the third rail of the program. I remember reading the traffic, the endless stream of position papers and risk assessments. Proponents, led by the increasingly influential Congressman Charlie Wilson and a small group of enthusiasts within the CIA, argued that without an effective anti-aircraft weapon, the war would settle into a bloody, indefinite stalemate. The Mujahideen would never be able to move from a purely defensive, harassing force to one that could take and hold territory. Opponents countered that the risks were unacceptable. The ISI's control over the weapons pipeline was already leaky. We knew weapons were being sold on the black market in the frontier territories. Handing them a Stinger was like handing a child a loaded gun in a crowded room. We were already providing Swiss Oerlikon anti-aircraft cannons and Chinese-made heavy machine guns, but they were defensive, positional weapons. They were heavy, required a crew, and had a large signature. The Stinger was different. It was a fire-and-forget weapon. A single man could carry it, shoot it, and disappear back into the landscape. It was the perfect guerrilla weapon. It was an offensive tool that would allow small, mobile units to actively hunt Soviet aircraft. The man who finally broke the deadlock was, ironically, not a hawk, but a pragmatist. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Fred Eichley commissioned a study. The conclusion was that the potential gains outweighed the risks, provided strict controls could be put in place. The decision was made in late 1985. President Reagan signed the finding. The Stinger was a go. A wave of nervous energy and excitement went through the station. This was it. This was the game changer. But the approval came with a mountain of conditions. The ISI was not to be trusted with the final distribution. For the first time, CIA officers would have to be directly involved in the training and deployment deep in the field. We had to account for every single missile tube and every gripstock. We had to create a chain of custody that was airtight. The first shipment of Stinger missiles arrived in early 1986. They didn't come through the main pipeline in Karachi. They were flown discreetly to a Pakistani airbase near Rawalpindi. I was there on the tarmac when the unmarked C-141 Starlifter opened its cargo bay. The green crates looked innocuous, but everyone present understood their significance. We were crossing a technological Rubicon. Our job was to set up a top-secret training program. We worked with a hand-picked team from the ISI to select the very first Mujahideen teams for Stinger training. We couldn't train them in Pakistan proper. It was too risky. The ISI established a covert training camp, Camp Mujahideen, deep inside Pakistan. The instructors were a mix of American Special Forces trainers, working under CIA cover, and ISI officers. I was a frequent visitor to that camp, a surreal place where 19th century tribal warriors were being taught to use 21st century technology. The Mujahideen chosen were often illiterate. They couldn't read the manuals. The trainers had to develop a purely practical, hands-on curriculum. They used diagrams, repetition, and a series of audible beeps and tones that the missile's seeker head made to teach the gunners how to acquire a target. The most crucial part of the training was the IFF system, identification friend or foe. We were terrified of them shooting down a Pakistani F-16 or a civilian plane. They were drilled relentlessly on aircraft silhouettes. Soviet Hinds and Frogfoots were a go. Anything else was a no-go. Each trained gunner had his thumbprint taken. Every missile was signed out. The serial number of the launch tube was recorded next to the name and thumbprint of the man who received it. We told them that for every spent launch tube they returned to us, they would receive a new missile. It was our attempt at inventory control in a lawless war zone. In September 1986, the first trained team was infiltrated across the border. They were a group under the command of a commander named Ghaffar, part of Jalaluddin Haqqani's network, a group known for its effectiveness and its close ties to the ISI. They carried 3 Stinger missiles. Their target was the Soviet airbase at Jalalabad. On September 25th, the team set up an ambush position overlooking the airfield's approach path. As a squadron of Mi-24 Hinds returned from a mission, the gunner shouldered the launcher, waited for the distinctive, high-pitched tone that signaled a solid lock, and fired. The missile shot out of the tube with a whoosh, its small booster motor kicking it clear before the main rocket ignited, sending it screaming towards its target. A few seconds later, one of the Hinds erupted in a ball of fire and fell from the sky. The team fired again, and a second Hind went down. In one afternoon, a single man with a 35-pound tube on his shoulder had done what thousands of fighters with rifles had failed to do for 7 years. He had destroyed Satan's chariot. The news reached us in Islamabad within hours, passed through a chain of radio messages. It was electric. We had done it. We had given the David of the Hindu Kush a sling that could slay Goliath. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. For the Mujahideen, it was a sign of divine intervention, a miracle weapon. For the Soviet pilots, it was terrifying. They had once ruled the skies with impunity. Now any hillside could hide a man with a missile. They were forced to change tactics immediately. They flew higher, out of the Stinger's range, which made them less effective at supporting ground troops. They deployed flares constantly, trying to decoy the missile's infrared seeker. The balance of the war had shifted, not just in our favor, but fundamentally. We had blinded the Soviet giant. We celebrated in the station that night, a quiet, knowing affair. We had taken the ultimate risk, and it had paid off spectacularly. But even in that moment of triumph, a small, cold knot of doubt formed in my stomach. We had just proven that a single, determined man with the right piece of technology could neutralize the air power of a superpower. It was a lesson we were teaching the world, and I couldn't shake the feeling that one day, someone might use that lesson against us. The success of the Jalalabad attack opened the floodgates. What had been a trickle of Stinger missiles became a steady, controlled flow. The program, now operating with a near-blank check from Congress, courtesy of Charlie Wilson's tireless efforts, entered its zenith. The scale of Operation Cyclone between 1986 and 1988 was something to behold. It was a massive, global enterprise hidden in plain sight, a symphony of covert action conducted by a cast of thousands. The annual budget swelled to over $600 million, a figure that didn't even include matching funds from Saudi Arabia, who were eager to support a Sunni jihad against the atheist Soviets. My world became a blur of logistics, high-stakes negotiations, and constant travel between the sterile confines of the embassy in Islamabad, the dusty chaos of Peshawar, and the clandestine training camps. We weren't just supplying stingers. We were providing a full spectrum of war-making capability. We sent in advanced long-range sniper rifles that could punch through Soviet body armor. We delivered state-of-the-art communications equipment that allowed commanders to coordinate attacks across multiple fronts. We provided mules, thousands of them. We bought up nearly every mule in northern Pakistan and beyond, as they were the only reliable way to transport heavy weapons and ammunition through the treacherous mountain passes into Afghanistan. The CIA became one of the world's largest buyers of pack animals. We supplied tons of C4 plastic explosive, which the Mujahideen, trained by ISI engineers, used to devastating effect on bridges, pipelines, and convoys. We even established a program to provide detailed satellite imagery of Soviet bases and troop movements, printed onto large maps that were smuggled across the border to key commanders. The pipeline was no longer just about guns. It was about creating a modern, technologically proficient guerrilla army. The ISI under General Akhtar was the heart of this machine. His organization grew in size and sophistication, becoming one of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the region, funded almost entirely by American and Saudi money. They built a vast infrastructure of depots, training facilities, and logistics networks. But their power came with a price for us. The issue of favoritism didn't just persist, it became institutionalized. Despite our efforts to control the stinger distribution, the ISI found ways to steer the majority of them, along with other high-value assets, to their preferred clients. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and his Hizb-i-Islami party remained the prime beneficiaries. Jalaluddin Haqqani, another hardliner whose network was brutally effective, also received a significant share. More moderate, traditionalist commanders like Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Lion of Panjshir, were consistently shortchanged. Massoud was arguably the most brilliant tactician of the war, a charismatic leader who had created a semi-independent state in his Panjshir Valley. But he was a Tajik, not a Pashtun, and he was fiercely independent, refusing to subordinate himself to the ISI's command. As a result, Akhtar viewed him with suspicion. We in the station argued vociferously for supplying Massoud directly. He was fighting the Soviets more effectively than anyone. But the ISI controlled the routes. Getting a single mule train to the Panjshir without the ISI's blessing was nearly impossible. It was a source of constant, bitter friction. We were funding a war, but we were not directing it. We were merely the financiers and quartermasters for Pakistan's regional ambitions. The blowback potential was no longer a theoretical concern. It was a daily reality. I remember a meeting in a Peshawar safe house with an Arab fighter who had come to join the jihad. He was young, educated, and spoke fluent English. He wasn't Afghan. He was from Saudi Arabia, a follower of a Palestinian scholar named Abdullah Azam, who was preaching that the fight in Afghanistan was a universal duty for all true Muslims. This young Saudi thanked me for the American support, but in the same breath he spoke of the great Satan America and the need to eventually turn the jihad against the West and its corrupt client regimes in the Middle East. He saw the war not as a fight for Afghan freedom, but as a training ground for a global revolution. His name was not important at the time. He was one of hundreds of so-called Afghan Arabs flocking to Peshawar. It was only years later, when I saw his face on a wanted poster, that the chilling significance of that conversation hit me. The name of the quiet, intense Saudi who had been a key financier for these foreign fighters also started to circulate more. Osama bin Laden. At the time, he was a peripheral figure, a wealthy construction scion who ran a support network for the Arab volunteers. He was not a major military player, and he was not on our radar as a direct asset or a primary threat. He was just part of the chaotic, increasingly radicalized ecosystem we were nurturing. By 1987, the tide had irrevocably turned. The Soviet military was trapped. The Stinger had neutralized their air advantage, and the increasingly well-armed and coordinated Mujahideen were inflicting unsustainable casualties on the ground. Soviet soldiers, mostly conscripts, were demoralized. Drug use was rampant. The war was crippling the Soviet economy. Back in Washington, it was hailed as a monumental victory. We were bringing a superpower to its knees without losing a single American soldier. We, the case officers on the ground, felt a sense of immense professional pride. We had executed one of the most successful covert operations in history, but it was a hollow victory. We had unleashed forces we did not understand and could not control. We had poured gasoline on the fire of radical Islam and handed the matches to the most extreme elements. We had built up the ISI into a regional powerhouse that was now playing a double game, supporting us against the Soviets while also cultivating assets that were deeply hostile to American interests. The end was in sight. The Soviets were signaling their desire for a negotiated exit. But as the prospect of a Soviet withdrawal grew closer, a new, more terrifying question began to haunt our discussions. What happens the day after they leave? What happens when this massive, well-armed, battle-hardened force of holy warriors, flush with victory, suddenly has no more Soviets to kill? We had built a perfect war machine, but we had given no thought to the off switch. The Geneva Accords were signed in April 1988, formalizing the Soviet Union's commitment to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. The agreement was a landmark diplomatic achievement, the culmination of years of negotiation. In Washington, it was declared mission accomplished. The primary objective of Operation Cyclone, the expulsion of the Soviet army, had been achieved. The program had been a resounding, unqualified success. From our perspective in Islamabad, it felt very different. It felt like the beginning of the end. The Soviets were leaving, yes, but they were not surrendering. They were leaving behind a well-armed and still functional Afghan government under President Mohammad Najibullah, a former head of the secret police, the Qiyad. The accords called for a symmetrical cessation of outside aid. We were supposed to stop arming the Mujahideen at the same time the Soviets stopped arming the Kabul regime. It was a fiction. The Reagan administration, pushed by hardliners and the ISI, invoked a clause that allowed us to continue supplying the Mujahideen as long as the Soviets supplied Najibullah. In reality, both sides opened the floodgates. The 6 months leading up to the final Soviet withdrawal in February 1989 saw the largest transfer of weaponry of the entire war. We were determined to ensure the Mujahideen had enough materiel to topple Najibullah's government, which most analysts in Washington predicted would collapse within weeks of the last Soviet soldier crossing back over the Friendship Bridge. The ISI, for its part, wanted to install its client, Hekmatyar, in Kabul as quickly as possible. The atmosphere in Peshawar was frenzied. It was a gold rush for weapons. Commanders who had spent years fighting with antique rifles were now being handed heavy artillery, multi-barrel rocket launchers, and vast quantities of ammunition. The focus shifted from guerrilla warfare to conventional siegecraft. The ISI, with our tacit approval, began planning a massive set-piece assault on the city of Jalalabad, intended to be the Mujahideen's provisional capital. The sense of an impending power vacuum was palpable and terrifying. The fragile alliances that had held the Mujahideen together against their common Soviet enemy began to fray almost immediately. The infighting, which had always simmered beneath the surface, exploded into open warfare. Hekmatyar's forces, flush with the best weapons from the ISI, launched attacks on Ahmad Shah Massoud's positions in the north, trying to seize territory and supply lines. Commanders settled old tribal scores with new, powerful weapons we had provided. The roads around Peshawar were clogged with trucks heading for the border, piled high with the instruments of death. We had taught them how to fight a superpower, but we had failed to teach them how to build a nation. On February 15, 1989, General Boris Gromov, the commander of the 40th Army, walked alone across the Friendship Bridge into Uzbekistan, the last Soviet soldier to leave Afghanistan. The images were broadcast around the world. In America, it was a moment of supreme vindication. We had won the Cold War's last great battle. In Afghanistan, it was the starting gun for a new, more savage conflict, a civil war. The predicted swift collapse of Najibullah's government didn't happen. His army, though demoralized, held together. They were fighting for their own survival now. The ISI-orchestrated assault on Jalalabad in March 1989 was an unmitigated disaster. The Mujahideen, accustomed to guerrilla tactics, proved inept at conventional combined arms warfare. They charged into prepared defensive positions and were slaughtered by the hundreds. Their command and control was chaotic, with different factions refusing to cooperate. It was a humiliating defeat, and it exposed the fundamental weakness of the resistance. They could unite to expel a foreign invader, but they could not unite to govern. With the Soviets gone, the rationale for Operation Cyclone evaporated. The spigot was turned off almost as quickly as it had been opened. The massive funding dried up. The CIA station in Islamabad, once the hub of a global operation, began to shrink. Case officers were reassigned. The logistics pipeline was dismantled. We just left. We washed our hands of it. The problem, as we saw it from Washington, was solved. The Soviets were gone. What came next was an internal Afghan matter. For those of us who had been there, it was a profound betrayal. We had spent a decade building this force, making promises to commanders, assuring them of our support. Now we were abandoning them to a charnel house of our own making. The country descended into a vortex of violence. The civil war of the early 1990s was in many ways more brutal than the war against the Soviets. It was a war of all against all. Kabul, which had been relatively unscathed during the Soviet occupation, was systematically destroyed by rockets and artillery fire from warring Mujahideen factions, many of whom were using the very weapons we had so eagerly supplied. Hekmatyr's forces in particular rained down thousands of rockets on the city, killing tens of thousands of civilians in their bid to seize power. My final years in the station were spent writing grim reports that few in Langley seemed to read. We were tracking the disintegration of a country. We watched as the heroes we had built up in the American press, the freedom fighters, became warlords, terrorizing their own people. The moral clarity of the anti-Soviet crusade dissolved into a murky, sickening grey. We had achieved our geopolitical objective, but the human cost was staggering, and the strategic consequences were only just beginning to unfold. We had sown the wind, and a whirlwind of unimaginable fury was beginning to gather in the ruins of the nation we had saved. The feeling was no longer one of triumph, but of deep, abiding dread. We had opened Pandora's box to defeat one enemy, and now, with the box wide open, new and more terrifying monsters were beginning to crawl out into the light. The departure of the Soviets in 1989 and the subsequent American disengagement created a perfect storm in Afghanistan and the surrounding region. We had left behind a country armed to the teeth, led by a fractured coalition of warlords with no functioning central government and a populace traumatized by more than a decade of unrelenting war. The civil war that followed was a free-for-all. The once celebrated Mujahideen factions carved the country into personal fiefdoms, preying on the population and battling each other for control of cities, roads, and opium fields. The grand cause of jihad against a foreign occupier had devolved into a squalid turf war. Najibullah's government in Kabul surprisingly held on for 3 years, sustained by a dwindling supply of Soviet aid and the fact that his military and political apparatus, for all its flaws, was more cohesive than the forces arrayed against him. But in 1992, with the collapse of the Soviet Union itself, his support vanished entirely, and his regime crumbled. The fall of Kabul, however, did not bring peace. It simply brought the war into the capital. The victorious Mujahideen factions, led by Massoud and Hekmatyar, immediately turned on each other. The battle for Kabul in the mid-1990s was apocalyptic. Entire neighborhoods were leveled. The city's infrastructure was destroyed. The population was subjected to horrific abuses, with civilians targeted based on their ethnicity or factional allegiance. From my now distant post, I read the intelligence reports with a growing sense of sickness. These were the men we had armed. This was the freedom we had delivered. While the warlords tore Afghanistan apart, a new force was quietly coalescing in the south, in the city of Kandahar, and in the refugee camps across the border in Pakistan. They were a movement of young religious students, many of them orphans of the Long War, educated in the Deobandi madrasas of Pakistan, seminaries that had been lavishly funded by Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states during the 1980s as part of the anti-Soviet effort. They were disgusted by the corruption and brutality of the warlords. They called themselves the Taliban, which simply means the students. They offered a simple, stark vision: an end to the war and the imposition of a pure, unadulterated form of Islamic law. Their initial rise was meteoric. They were bankrolled by Pakistan's ISI, which had grown disillusioned with its old client, Hekmatyar, and saw the Taliban as a new, more pliable proxy force that could finally deliver Pakistan its coveted strategic depth. They were also secretly funded by Saudi Arabia, who favored their austere brand of Sunni Islam. The Taliban were well armed, not directly by us, but by the spoils of the war we had fueled. They captured massive arsenals from the warring factions, weapons we had paid for, and they were reinforced by ISI support. The war-weary Afghan population, desperate for any semblance of order, initially welcomed them. In 1994, they swept out of Kandahar, and by September 1996, they had captured Kabul, hanging the former President Najibullah from a lamppost. The era of the warlords was over. The era of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan had begun. Back in the United States, Afghanistan had become the forgotten war. Our victory was complete. Our attention had moved on to other crises in the Balkans and the Middle East. The rise of the Taliban was noted, but it was largely seen as a positive development. At least they had stopped the civil war. Their brutal social policies, the banning of music, the public executions, the complete subjugation of women were condemned but ultimately ignored. It was an internal matter. It was no longer our problem, but it was our problem. Because in the anarchic, failed state we had helped create, another figure from the 1980s jihad had found a new home. Osama bin Laden, the Saudi financier who had run the support network for Arab volunteers, had been expelled from Saudi Arabia and then Sudan. In 1996, he accepted the Taliban's invitation and moved his operations to Afghanistan. He brought with him his wealth, his organizational skills, and a global network of veterans from the anti-Soviet war. This network was now formalized into a new organization, Al-Qaeda, the base. The Taliban provided Al-Qaeda with a safe haven, a state within a state where they could train, plot, and prepare for the next phase of their global jihad. The training camps that the ISI had helped establish in the 1980s to fight the Soviets were reactivated and expanded, now with a new target, the United States. I saw the intelligence trickle in, reports of sophisticated training facilities, of plots against American embassies, of bin Laden's public declarations of war against the far enemy, America. But the dots were not yet connected in a coherent way. The threat seemed distant, abstract. We had, in effect, created the perfect incubator for international terrorism. We had supplied the hardware, billions of dollars in weapons and military infrastructure. The Saudis had supplied the software, the extremist Wahhabi ideology that fueled the global jihad movement. The ISI had provided the operational platform and the local expertise, and the Soviet invasion had provided the cause, the crucible that forged a generation of hardened, radicalized fighters from across the Muslim world. The veterans of Operation Cyclone were scattered throughout al-Qaeda's leadership. The tactics they used, asymmetric warfare, IEDs, targeting infrastructure, were the same tactics we and the ISI had taught them to use against the Soviets. The Stinger missile became the ultimate symbol of our short-sightedness. We moved heaven and earth to get them back, launching a multi-million-dollar buyback program in the 1990s. We recovered a few hundred, but hundreds more remained unaccounted for, their whereabouts a constant source of anxiety for counter-terrorism officials. The lesson we had taught the world, that a small determined group with the right technology and ideology could challenge a superpower, had been fully absorbed by our students. They had watched us help them defeat one superpower. Now, they believed it was their destiny to defeat the other. The blowback was no longer a theoretical risk. It was a ticking time bomb, hidden in the mountains of the country we thought we had won. The years leading up to the new millennium were, for me, a period of quiet retirement and uneasy reflection. I had left the agency carrying with me a library of memories that I couldn't share and a burden of complicity that was hard to shake. I would watch the news, catching glimpses of Afghanistan, a country now synonymous with the medieval brutality of the Taliban and the shadowy threat of al-Qaeda. Each report felt like a postscript to my own life's work. The connections were so blindingly obvious to me, yet the world seemed to suffer from a collective amnesia. The narrative of the 1980s was one of heroic freedom fighters, of a righteous victory over the evil empire. The grim sequel of the 1990s was treated as a separate, unrelated story. I saw the direct causal line connecting the two. I saw the faces of the young, zealous fighters I had met in Peshawar, the ones who spoke of a global jihad while holding weapons we had paid for. I saw the calculating eyes of General Akhtar, who had played us so brilliantly, taking our money and guns to advance his own radical agenda. I saw the crates of stingers on the tarmac in Rawalpindi, each one a seed from which a terrible harvest would grow. The core of our strategic failure was a profound lack of imagination. We could not, or would not, imagine a world after the Cold War. Our entire operational focus was on the defeat of the Soviet Union. Every decision, every risk assessment, every dollar spent was measured against that single metric. The long-term nature of the forces we were unleashing, tribalism, religious extremism, Pakistani regional ambitions, were dismissed as secondary concerns, future problems for someone else to solve. We saw the Mujahideen as instruments of our policy, chess pieces to be moved against our adversary. We failed to grasp that they saw us as instruments of their holy war, temporary and disposable allies of convenience in their much longer, more cosmic struggle. We thought we were the puppet masters, but in many ways, we were the puppets, our strings pulled by actors whose scripts we couldn't even read. The very success of Operation Cyclone contained the seeds of its failure. We proved that a non-state actor, properly funded and armed, could defeat a modern, conventional army. We democratized high-tech warfare, taking weapons like the Stinger out of the hands of nation-states and giving them to insurgents. We created a global network for recruiting, training, and deploying jihadist fighters, a network that al-Qaeda would inherit and perfect. The Afghan Arabs who flocked to the fight against the Soviets became the hardened cadre of a new international terrorist movement. They came from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Algeria, and the Philippines. In Afghanistan, they learned bomb-making, guerrilla tactics, and covert communications. They forged bonds in the crucible of war. And after the Soviets left, they went home, or to new fronts in Bosnia, Chechnya, and Somalia, taking their skills and their ideology with them. Afghanistan became their Harvard and their West Point. The money trail was just as damning. The vast sums of unaccounted-for cash that we and the Saudis poured into the region fueled a massive black economy of arms and opium. It corrupted Pakistani society from the top down and created powerful vested interests in perpetual conflict. The ISI, which we had built from a modest agency into a kingmaker, became a rogue elephant, nurturing extremist groups like the Taliban and Lashkar-e-Taiba as instruments of its foreign policy, even as it maintained a veneer of cooperation with the United States. The irony was savage. The tactics used by Al-Qaeda in the 1998 embassy bombings in Africa, the 2000 attack on the USS Cole, and ultimately on 9/11, were a direct reflection of the curriculum we had sponsored. The use of suicide bombers, the targeting of symbolic infrastructure, the ability to operate in small, clandestine cells, this was the textbook of asymmetric warfare we had helped write. When I looked back at the decision to supply the Stinger, it felt like the pivotal moment. It was a decision made with the best of intentions and the worst of foresight. It won us the battle against the Soviets in Afghanistan, but it may have cost us the war for a generation's peace. It taught our future enemies our most valuable lesson, that the greatest powers on earth have vulnerabilities, that their technological superiority can be negated, and that a few determined men with the right tools and an unshakable belief can change the course of history. We wanted to give the Soviets their Vietnam. We succeeded. In the process, we created the conditions for our own. The blowback wasn't just a consequence of Operation Cyclone, it was its most enduring legacy. We had gone to Afghanistan to fight a devil, and in our zeal, we had inadvertently unleashed a legion of them. The chain of events was a Greek tragedy, a story of hubris and unintended consequences playing out on a global stage. And I, like so many others who served in that secret war, was left to wonder if the victory we celebrated so loudly in 1989 was, in fact, the most catastrophic defeat imaginable. The price for defeating the Red Army in the Hindu Kush was a bill that would come due on a clear blue morning in September, a decade later. Then came the morning of September 11th, 2001. I was watching the news from my home in Virginia, a cup of coffee in my hand, when the first plane hit the North Tower. Like everyone else, I was stunned, confused. When the second plane hit the South Tower, the confusion turned to a cold, sickening certainty. This was not an accident. This was an attack. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, where it had come from. The architects of this horror were the ghosts of my past. They were the men who had been forged in the crucible we had created. The face of Osama bin Laden, once a peripheral file in our databases, was now the face of a new global enemy. The name of Al-Qaeda, once a footnote in intelligence reports about radical splinter groups, was now on the lips of every person on the planet. The sanctuary they had used to plan this attack was Afghanistan, the country we had liberated and then abandoned, now ruled by their Taliban protectors. The 20 years between the Soviet invasion and the attacks on New York and Washington formed a single, unbroken chain of causality. Every link in that chain was something I had witnessed firsthand. The initial decision to bleed the Soviets, the massive influx of weapons and cash, the empowerment of the ISI, the deliberate choice to fund the most radical and effective fighters, The introduction of the stinger, the celebration of victory, the abrupt and total disengagement, the descent into civil war, the rise of the Taliban, and the welcoming of Al-Qaeda. It was one long, continuous story. And the final chapter was written in fire and steel on American soil. In the weeks and months that followed 9/11, the United States prepared to go to war in Afghanistan. It was the most bitter and tragic irony I could possibly imagine. We were sending a new generation of American soldiers to go into the same mountains, to fight against the very men, or at least the ideological descendants of the men, we had armed and trained a decade earlier. Our new allies on the ground were to be the Northern Alliance, the very same forces of Ahmad Shah Massoud, whom we had consistently neglected and starved of support in the 1980s at the behest of our then allies, the ISI. Massoud himself had been assassinated by Al-Qaeda agents just 2 days before 9/11, a clear sign that the attacks were imminent. Our new enemy was the Taliban, a movement that would likely never have existed without the political and military vacuum we left behind, and the direct support of the ISI, our primary partner in Operation Cyclone. It was a war born of a war, a conflict spawned from the unintended consequences of a previous victory. The talking heads on television debated the new challenges of fighting in Afghanistan. They spoke of the rugged terrain, the tribal complexities, the difficulty of asymmetric warfare. I would watch them and feel a profound sense of despair. None of this was new. We had written the playbook. We had trained the players. We were now fighting against our own shadow. I thought about the Stinger missiles. In the initial phase of the 2001 invasion, American and coalition pilots flew with the constant nagging fear that a Stinger, one of ours, could come screaming up from a hillside to take them down. The nightmare scenario of the 1980s, that the weapon would be turned against us, had become a real tactical consideration. Thankfully, it seems the missile's batteries had largely degraded over the years, or the remaining ones were in the hands of factions who didn't use them. But the fear was a potent symbol of the entire enterprise. We had given them the sword, and we were now forced to face its edge. The legacy of Operation Cyclone is not a simple one. It is a tangled web of success and failure, of noble intentions and catastrophic outcomes. Did we help end the Cold War? Yes. There is a strong argument that the bleeding of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan was a significant factor in its eventual collapse. It was a decisive geopolitical victory, achieved at a remarkably low cost in American lives. We defeated our great rival, but the cost was transferred with interest to the future. We achieved a short-term strategic victory at the expense of long-term global stability. We traded a visible, conventional enemy for a diffuse, ideological one that was far harder to fight. We solved one problem by creating a dozen more. The men and women at the CIA who ran Operation Cyclone, myself included, were dedicated public servants. We believed in our mission. We worked tirelessly, took immense personal risks, and did what our country asked of us. We were fighting to stop the spread of what we saw as a godless totalitarian empire. There was a moral clarity to that fight that is perhaps difficult to understand now. But our vision was blinkered. We were so focused on the bear in front of us that we failed to see the vipers breeding at our feet. We failed to understand the power of the ideology we were so casually co-opting for our own ends. We failed to ask the most important question: what comes next? The story of Operation Cyclone is a cautionary tale for the ages. It is a lesson in the law of unintended consequences, a stark reminder that the means one uses to achieve a goal can have a more lasting impact than the goal itself. It demonstrates the peril of forging alliances of convenience with those whose fundamental values are antithetical to your own. And it serves as a permanent painful answer to the question I posed at the beginning. Is it right to arm your enemy's enemy? After living through the fallout of that decision for the rest of my life, I can tell you that sometimes the devil you know is far, far better than the one you create. The shadow of that operation is long, and we are all still living in it. The war in Afghanistan that began in 2001 stretched on for 20 years, becoming the longest war in American history. It was a conflict defined by a grim, cyclical rhythm. We would surge troops, clear an area of Taliban fighters, attempt to build up local Afghan security forces, and then, as we drew down, watch the Taliban seep back in, often stronger and more resilient than before. It was a war against ghosts, fought in the same valleys and mountain passes where we had once helped another set of ghosts fight a different enemy. I watched it all unfold from the quiet remove of retirement, a historian of a disaster still in progress. Every new strategy, every new initiative felt like a desperate attempt to unscramble an egg. We were trying to build a modern, centralized, democratic state in a place that had no history or appetite for one, a place whose social fabric we had helped to shred a generation earlier. We were fighting a war against an insurgency that was funded, armed, and given safe haven by our supposed major non-NATO ally, Pakistan. The ISI continued its double game with masterful skill, taking billions in American aid to fight terrorism while simultaneously nurturing the very Taliban insurgency that was killing American soldiers. It was the same cynical strategy they had employed in the 1980s, simply adapted for a new patron and a new set of circumstances. We were paying them to both start and fight the fire. The parallels were maddening and tragic. In the 80s, we funneled weapons through Pakistan to Pashtun proxies to fight the government in Kabul. In the 2000s, Pakistan funneled weapons to Pashtun proxies to fight the government in Kabul. The only thing that had changed was who was backing that government. The American soldiers on the ground were, in a very real sense, fighting the legacy of their own country's foreign policy. The IEDs that became the signature weapon of the war, killing and maiming thousands of troops, were an evolution of the bomb-making techniques the ISI had taught the Mujahideen with our funding and our explosives. The guerrilla tactics used by the Taliban, the ambushes, the hit-and-run attacks, the use of the terrain for concealment, were from the same curriculum. The very existence of a battle-hardened, ideologically motivated rural insurgency was the direct result of the war machine we had built and then abandoned. I often thought about the concept of blowback. It's a term we used in the agency to describe the unintended negative consequences of a covert operation. Operation Cyclone is the textbook definition of blowback, a case study that should be taught at every war college and diplomatic academy. It's a story of how a tactical success can become a strategic catastrophe. We won the battle, but created the conditions for a perpetual war. We defeated one enemy, but midwifed a new one that was arguably more dangerous because it was decentralized, ideological, and global. The end, when it came in August 2021, was a shocking and humiliating replay of history. The American withdrawal and the subsequent collapse of the Afghan National Army in a matter of days was a bitter echo of the Soviet departure and the fall of Najibullah's regime. Once again, a foreign power, weary of a long and costly war, left. Once again, the military force it had spent billions to train and equip melted away in the face of a highly motivated insurgent force. And once again, the Taliban swept into Kabul, taking power without a fight. The images from Kabul airport, the desperate people clinging to the sides of a C-17, the chaos, the panic, were a devastating indictment of 2 decades of failed policy, a failure rooted in the original sins of the 1980s. When the last American soldier departed, The Taliban were in control of more of Afghanistan than they had been in 2001. They had access to billions of dollars worth of abandoned American military equipment. A final, bitter irony. We had come full circle. The project that began in 1979 with the goal of expelling a foreign power and shaping the future of Afghanistan had ended in 2021 with our own ignominious expulsion, and the country in the hands of the very extremists our actions had helped to empower. The legacy of Operation Cyclone is not just Al-Qaeda and 9/11. It's the 20-year war that followed. It's the trillions of dollars spent, the hundreds of thousands of lives lost, American, Allied, and Afghan. It's the destabilization of an entire region. It's the creation of a permanent jihadi narrative of victory against two superpowers, a narrative that will inspire extremists for generations to come. It's the profound and cynical lesson taught to the world that America is an unreliable partner, one that will arm you for its own purposes and then abandon you when those purposes are served. Looking back now, from the vantage point of old age, the whole affair seems like a colossal, tragic mistake driven by hubris. We saw the world as a chessboard and the people in it as pawns. We failed to see the human dimension, the power of belief, the currents of history that were far stronger than our covert machinations. We thought we could light a fire and control the blaze, but we ended up burning down the whole house, and our own, in the process. The ghosts of Afghanistan don't just haunt the mountains of the Hindu Kush. They haunt the halls of power in Washington. They haunt the quiet homes of veterans. And they haunt the memory of old spooks like me who now have nothing but time to contemplate the cost of victory. The final, terrible truth of Operation Cyclone is that in our effort to defeat a monster, we created others. And in the end, we became entangled in their story. A story of violence and sorrow that has no end in sight.